It's me, Egbert, once again. I'm the new owner of this station. I went out and hired the best talk radio consultant, Jeff Allen from News Talk STL, and told him to hire the worst talent he could find. Jeff did exactly as I told him. Ladies and gentlemen, here are Brad and John.
It is the BJ Show, and I haven't said this for a couple of days. I need to reiterate this, that if you're listening to this on the podcast or on the YouTube channel, which we have, that's bjshow.video. We actually do this show live. Some people think this is just some people think this is just a podcast. It's not. We do the show live on Egbert 104.5 every morning, Monday through Friday from 7 to 8 o'clock. So you can listen to us live, listen to the stream, listen to us on the podcast, listen to us. You can go to find the podcast on bjshow.co. You can find it on egbert.com, or you can find it on bjshow.video, all sorts of different places. Okay, the chief.
And thank you real quick, Brad. It's a good opportunity to thank all the people who choose to share our show with other people, whether that's on Twitter, whether it's sharing stories on Instagram, whether it's just sending it to their friends. Thanks to everybody who spreads the word about the show. We appreciate it.
And occasionally we get some interesting feedback because of the fact that what we try to do with this show, we try to not make it into the noon show at noon on KWMU, which is just so exciting. Excuse me.
What do you mean, Brad? Brad, what do you mean by the word exciting? It has several intersectionality themes.
In other words, we try to give you some information, throw out some crazy ideas, and by the same time have some fun with it. Okay, the chief of police's name in Ferguson. His name is Terry. What's his last name?
A.K.A. Troy Doyle.
Troy Doyle. Okay, Troy Doyle. I don't know where Terry came from. Okay, and let's be honest with this because this needs to be said. He is a black gentleman, correct?
Is he, Brad? I don't see color, Brad. I'm colorblind. He appears to have a lot of melanin in his skin, yes.
They had him on Mark Reardon's show yesterday afternoon, and you could tell he was still very upset. And primarily, when they first got him on, Mark asked about the condition of the officer who was injured Friday night, and the chief said he was still in intensive care, and they sort of went on with the show. But later they asked about him again, and they said he has never regained consciousness, which is not a good thing.
Oh,
I mean, that's a horrible thing. Now, second off on this is that Justin Sparks, who we've talked about before, who is a state rep, used to be a St. Louis County police officer. I saw a posting, I believe it was I can't remember if it was on Facebook or it was on Twitter, about how he's so upset about this because he's a personal friend of this police officer. And I believe that is because this police officer used to work for St. Louis County. Did you know this aspect of him?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Okay, so Justin knows the guy personally, worked with him. And matter of fact, I'm almost positive that he worked for St. Louis County because I saw a picture of him somewhere with a St. Louis County police uniform, and now
you saw that, yep.
He's a Ferguson police officer. So the chief goes through this whole situation, explains what happened, and I'm going to tell you something because this is really weird for me because this is deja vu, okay? They kept referring to a fence, and I'm not 100% sure of this, but I'm probably about 95% sure of this, that when they're referring to a fence, they're talking about one of those temporary fences that there's made out of metal, but sort of looks like a bike rack. You know what I'm talking about?
I do, and it was added, to be clear, from what I read, Brad, this is a new one that was just added in the last few weeks.
Right.
So it's not one that existed during the 2014 riots. Yep.
Well, but this is what's interesting. On the Monday night, I don't know the date, it's sometime in November. If you go back and look at the calendar 10 years ago, whatever the Monday before Thanksgiving was, that was the night that Bob McCullough came out with the verdict. And I had been in Ferguson, I don't know, a couple dozen times previous to that, been there the day after the thing. And why was I there? Because of the fact that I had this crazy thing, this crazy, part of me ignited by a professor back in my college days, Dr. Camille Winter, who was an incredible journalistic professor who, if he were alive today, would not be able to turn on any TV because he just would drive him nuts to see what's happened to journalism. Okay, I went up there And I wanted to see for myself, and I took my phone, and I took my cameras, and I did various videos and things like that. That Monday night, the police department sits on the east side of Florissant Road. And I know this is confusing because of the fact, if you don't know North County, what's crazy about this is West Florissant is east of Florissant Road. So you would think
That's right. I can never figure that out,
yeah,
Brad.
you would think that West Florissant would be on the west side of Florissant Road, but no, it's on the east side of Florissant Road. So you have Florissant Road, you have West Florissant Road, and they're parallel. They go north and south. So the police department sits on the east side of Florissant Road, okay? That night, they had the same, I want to say, probably the same kind of barricades up, this metal fencing that went right down the center line of Florissant Road, because they were expecting no good. And there were no police around. And I was on the other side of Florissant Road. I was on the west side of Florissant Road, where a bunch of people were gathering. And I could tell the crowd was getting a little bit rowdy. And I personally witnessed several people in the crowd consuming alcoholic beverages and smoking, at the time, illegal marijuana substances, okay?
That's right.
So we're talking about, it's bad enough that these people are not in the best mood because of the fact that this has been rioting and and unrest has been going on for a long time. But they're getting liquored up and they're getting smoked up, okay?
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, what could possibly go wrong? Okay, so they start chanting somewhere on one of my devices. It's in a mini iPad, and I can't remember what I did with this mini iPad because I don't think at the time I had it on iCloud. I can't find this. They started a chant, and at one point in time, a guy on our side runs up to the fence, this portable fencing, and starts jiggling it a little bit, okay? Then another guy runs up to the fence and starts jiggling it a lot. And then a third guy runs up to the fence and gives it like a karate kick, like one of those airborne kind of karate kicks, and knocks over part of the fence. At this point in time, the door from the Ferguson Police Department opened, and a bunch of police officers come out and stand essentially shoulder to shoulder, okay? Now, the reason I mention this was 10 years ago. From where Troy was explaining this, it sounded like almost the exact same thing, where they had this temporary fencing up, and apparently some people started rocking the fence, and that's when Troy essentially said to his officers, we need to go out there and TCB. They went outside, and as he said, the police officer who was injured was tackled football style, like a linebacker hitting a wide receiver, and the guy did a flying leap, left his feet, tackled the police officer with such force when the police officer fell, he whacked the back of his head against the pavement, and essentially was critically injured instantly by this tackle. Okay, so I'm thinking to myself, what is going on with this? Then it comes out that they made a couple other arrests, one of whom, I don't know if you know this part of the story, one of whom
yeah, he's gone now, but go ahead. Or he's on leave now, but go ahead, Brad.
Well, are you talking about the guy who's on the police advisory board?
Yeah. So he's on leave from that.
Right.
I guess he
one of the guys
is suspended from that.
Who's on the police advisory board for the city of St. Louis got arrested in Ferguson for roughing up cops. And I'm going like, okay, now hold on a minute. How can you have somebody on the police advisory board who's showing up in Ferguson who essentially gets arrested for, I don't know what his arrest was, assault or something, a police officer?
Yeah.
Explain that to me. That would be like...
Well, go ahead, Brett. That
would be like somebody who was on the fire board for a fire department showing up at a fire with a can of gasoline and said, hey, you guys need to fight this fire even more. You need more flames, and throwing gas on the fire,
So I have a link up today, and for folks who don't want to pay the Post is Fast paywall, you can find a paywall-free link. The gentleman's name is Keith Rose, and I believe I know he's a transgender activist. I'm not sure if he or she is actually a transgender or not. But a unique piece of this, Brad, is that I had just assumed that this was someone that Tashara Jones had appointed to the Civilian Oversight Board. But it turns out that the mayor said that she nominated this gentleman for the position after he was, quote, the only eligible applicant for it. He was then unanimously confirmed by the Board of Aldermen. So in other words, he applied for a job that nobody else apparently who applied for it was qualified. So it appears as though the mayor didn't have any choice but to take him.
Man, well, there's a couple different ways you can go with what you just said. You could say, well, A, nobody maybe knew about it. Maybe they didn't promote it. B, everybody said, not doing that.
Yeah, exactly.
What no
now,
part of that.
You brought up a really good point that I didn't know. I'm glad you brought this up. All the media reports that I've seen about this say that the officer was knocked to the ground or he, quote, fell. Brad, I didn't know until you shared that anecdote from Troy Doyle that this officer was tackled.
Yeah, that's what he said. He said that it was like, he referred to it, I think his exact word was he used like linebacker, because he used a football reference, and admit something to you, not being the football, once again, a guy who used to own a sports station. If you said to me, okay, name me all the positions on the field and are on a football team, and when they're in a lineup, and show me where they're at, I could tell you who the center was, and I could tell you where the quarterback was, and I could tell you who the tight ends were, and past that, I wasn't lost. I have no idea where the linebacker or the guards and stuff like that. And even my son played high school football, but that's a whole other story. Yeah, he said it was like a flying tackle, like a linebacker taking, I think he actually said linebacker taking back down a wide receiver. You can go and listen to, if you go pull up, if you go to Odyssey and download their app, they have a incredible app where you can go and listen to previous shows. As a matter of fact, it's even sort of interesting if you're listening to the show and you hear something, you can grab the app and you can actually rewind it and actually listen to like the last 5, 10, 15 minutes, whatever, so you can pull up things like that. So I mean, you can tell it sounded like, to me, and maybe this is the mark of a good leader, a good police chief, it sounded like he, as a father, was talking about one of his kids being injured and in the hospital. It wasn't like, well, Officer so-and-so was a good officer and he did his job well. Here's a guy, you could tell he was emotional about this, and he goes into the dissertation. He says, we have done everything. He says there's not one single thing that the commission came out with after this that we haven't implemented. And he goes through the thing. We've done this training. We've done that training. We've done this training. And he even said, we got new uniforms, because he said some people were triggered by the old Ferguson uniforms. They got new uniforms. They have different squad car markings. The cars are now the same logos. He says they've changed everything. And then he starts giving statistics, that their statistics are like, I think he said last year they did 30,000 calls or something like that, and they said that the use of force was less than 1%. Now, do the math on that. When you start doing 30,000, 1% would be, if it was 1% of 300, it would be 3. 1% of 3,000 would be 30. 1% of 30,000 would be 300. Wouldn't that be right? Three. If
to quote Chevy Chase quoting Gerald Ford, I was told there would be no math.
Well, it's, in other words, anytime you say less than 1%, it's pretty apparent that it's not something that happens every other hour. You know what I mean? It's not something that happens like 5 times a day.
Yeah, I get it, sure.
So, and I'm thinking to myself, this guy, sometimes you hear people and you think, wow, that guy sounds like he's a good superintendent of schools or whatever. And then you find out he's the worst or she's the worst. But from listening to this, I thought to myself, this guy has gone through all the things. He's enumerated all the issues. He's addressed all the complaints. Everything that everybody said was right, and he just essentially said there's no call for what happened. There's no call for any of this rioting. There's no call for any of this because we have made amends. Now, I'm sort of paraphrasing what he said, but that's essentially what he's saying. And then they ended the interview by Mark said, okay, one more time update, and that's when he said he has not regained consciousness since Friday night, which I'm going like, okay, you know what? Whenever you hear that, you go like, "That's never good." You
Yeah,
know,
it's not a good thing. And when he comes back, what will remain of him?
well, he's still in ICU, and there's still a chance. You know how this is. I mean, you know, I had a friend of mine that worked you know, in intensive care, and always talked about the fact that the head injuries were real spooky stuff, that sometimes people made miraculous recoveries, and sometimes they literally didn't recover at all and they passed away, which is sort of sad. So anyway, that's
when it comes to, I mean, so I don't mean to, so completely separate topic, because I don't mean to make any kind of levity involving this situation, but you mentioned jiggling fences. Why don't you see, like, when the Breezethrough pant is not performing well at Lululemon, why don't you see women outside Lululemon before the store opens jiggling that fence, Brad? Why can't you go to Frontenac and see a bunch of shapely white women wearing Lululemon jiggling there? Like, why does it have to be Ferguson? Like, why can't we have a little cultural appropriation in West County and, you know, jiggle a fence outside the Lululemon store?
John, I have a listener friend of mine who listens to this show, doesn't listen real time, listens to the podcast. From time to time, I either get a text or I get a phone call. And it's about, why does John have to be so male? And I can't remember exactly what she says. She says, essentially, you always bring things down to making fun of women. And I'm going like,
how is that making, I just praised women. How is that making fun of women?
It's, see, there's a thing in comedy called observational comedy, okay? And observational comedy is a comic who looks at us in our everyday life and pulls out certain things which he or she finds to be amusing when you sort of, you know, put the microscope on certain actions. So first off, there is no fence at Plaza Frontenac, so the women would not be jiggling a fence.
They have it. So there's not a fence that comes down in front of Lululemon when the store's closed, Brad?
Well, but that's not necessarily a fence. That would be like,
what would you call? Would you call it a gate? I mean, do you want to parse language here?
That's the gate. That's like the door. You know, it's like a door. It's
so the fence that slides down at the end of the day and lifts up at the beginning of the day, that's not a fence? Okay, if you want to call it a gate, call it a gate.
First off, how do you know there's that thing? Have you been in a, sounds like
I have been, Brad. Have you been to the Lululemon store with a shapely woman at Frontenac?
John?
And I don't mean an amorphous blob that complains about John. I mean, have you been there with a woman that can actually fit into a pair of Lululemon pants?
John, let me tell you, here's the problem I have. When I get off of Highway 40, right there at Lindbergh, and I head south in Lindbergh, I immediately get pulled over by the Frontenac police, and they do what's called checking visas, and they look at my driver's license, and they said, Mr. Hildebrand, we think that you might be better off driving somewhere else, if you know what we're saying. Wink, wink, nod, nod. Have a good day. And I'm sort of redirected to get back on Highway 40 and head east.
Oh,
yeah.
I will point out too, Brad, that this is a great example. I think about this often of if you hear something you don't like, you think, am I objecting to the fact that the way that the person said it makes me feel a certain way? Ooh. Or am I objecting to the fact that the person is wrong about a detail?
Well,
so, I mean, I would suggest someone not, be a little less, how should I say it, Brad? Lamer?
Okay, so
maybe a little less lamer.
So, John, what maybe my field trip today would, I'll borrow a car and I'll wear a disguise and I'll get into Plaza Frontenac and I will go report on the Lululemon store and I will make a report of A, if there is a fence or a gate or what kind of a closure there is there, and B, what kind of women are there. How's that? And if they're all,
that's a fantastic. Hey, take some good pictures too. Make sure to include their face, because to me that's intrinsic to the woman. And I don't want to just see a creep shot of a body. Like I got to see the face. I got to make sure if the genetics are right.
Should I tape my tape? What do you call it? Tape measure thing like the tailors use that like that long piece of fabric which has the numbers on. Should I ask the women, hey ma'am, I'm doing research for John Combest. Could you come over here and let me take your measurements? And
no, because they know, because if she's hot, I probably already have her pictures in my phone. I don't need you to take measurements, Brad. I have I have a pair of hands that if they can't meet around the waist, then they're just put in, well, I don't know. Anyway, Brad, at 7, well, I won't give the time because you don't like when I do that. But we've reached the end of the second segment, Brad.
Well, the problem is, it's not that I don't like it. It's just that I edit out the time meanings or the time mentions because of the fact that when people are listening to it, the time doesn't make any sense. And normally, if you notice, the last thing out of my mouth before we go to break is the time. That way, I usually hesitate like this. I'm going to hesitate. Then I say...
Thanks for checking out the Brad and John Show podcast. This segment of the show is brought to you by John Combest's book, Stalking, Harassment, Internet Trolling, A Guide to Recovering and Rebuilding After Online Attacks. It's a great reference if you've ever been the unfortunate target of a social media attack. It's available on Amazon. Just search John Combest. That's Combest, John Combest, and the book will show up in your search results. Now it's time for another segment of the Brad and John Show. Can you handle it?